The bright fluorescent lights of JFK International Airport bounced off the polished floors as Amara Okafor wheeled her carry-on through the busy terminal. Her shoulders ached from the 14-hour flight, but her mind remained sharp, focused on the international summit she would be attending as her country's lead diplomat. The clock on the wall showed 7:45 p.m., still enough time to reach her hotel, review her notes, and be ready for tomorrow's opening session. Amara adjusted her navy blazer and smoothed back a few loose strands of hair that had escaped her knee bun. Around her, other passengers from her flight moved freely, their faces showing relief as they neared the exit. Some chatted excitedly about their New York plans, while others spoke quietly on phones, announcing their arrival to waiting friends and family. Almost there, Amara thought, catching a glimpse of her reflection in a nearby window. The diplomatic passport in her hand had made international travel smoother over her 10-year career, though she'd learned that even credentials couldn't always shield her from certain realities. As the crowd moved toward the security checkpoint, Amara noticed something that made her heart sink. The security officer at the main desk kept glancing in her direction, then whispering to his colleague. She'd seen that look before, that mix of suspicion and judgment that had nothing to do with security protocols. Amara took a deep breath and continued forward, diplomatic credentials clearly visible on the tag attached to her luggage. The line moved quickly, with travelers being waved through after brief document checks. A young white couple in front of her passed through with barely a glance at their papers. The middle-aged Asian businessman after them received a similar quick review. When Amara stepped forward, everything changed. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening," said the officer, a man with cold eyes and a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach them. His name had read Officer Wilson. "Is there a problem?" Amara asked calmly, her accent reflecting her education at international schools. "Just routine," Officer Wilson replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We randomly select passengers for enhanced security checks." Amara noticed she was the only randomly selected person in sight. The uncomfortable feeling in her stomach grew, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Of course," she said, stepping to the side as directed. From the corner of her eye, she saw other travelers watching the scene unfold. Some looked away awkwardly, while others stared openly, curiosity mixed with discomfort on their faces. Officer Wilson called over a female colleague. "We'll need to check your bags thoroughly, ma'am." Amara nodded, watching as they began unpacking her carefully organized suitcase. The important diplomatic documents she'd arranged precisely for tomorrow's meeting were pulled out and flipped through with little care. Her personal items, clothes, toiletries, a framed photo of her family, were spread across the inspection table. "What brings you to the United States?" Officer Wilson asked, though her diplomatic passport and credentials should have made this obvious. "I'm here as a diplomatic representative for the African Economic Summit," Amara responded, keeping her voice steady despite the growing knot of frustration in her chest. "My credentials are right there on my passport and in the diplomatic pouch you're currently examining." Officer Wilson barely glanced at the documents. "And how long do you plan to stay?" "1 week, as stated in my visa and in the official invitation letter from the State Department," Amara said, pointing to the letter that now lay haphazardly on the table. Other passengers continued to stream past, many casting curious glances at the unfolding scene. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, stared openly as she passed by with her mother, who quickly pulled her along with a hushed, "Don't stare." 20 minutes had passed, and Amara was still being held at the checkpoint, while others from her flight had long since departed. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, familiar yet no less degrading each time it happened. But today would be different. Today, her diplomatic status wasn't just a line on her passport, it was about to change everything. Officer Wilson circled Amara like a hawk eyeing its prey. His heavy boots squeaked against the polished floor as he moved, creating an uncomfortable rhythm that matched Amara's heartbeat. The diplomatic documents she'd carefully organized now lay scattered across the inspection table, their official seals and stamps seemingly meaningless to him. "So you claim to be a diplomat?" he asked, emphasizing the word "claim" in a way that made his disbelief obvious. His eyebrows rose slightly, as if the very idea was somehow amusing. I am the Deputy Foreign Minister for Economic Affairs, Amara replied evenly, her finger pointing to her credentials. As you can see from my diplomatic passport and these official documents. Officer Wilson picked up her passport between his thumb and forefinger as if touching something distasteful. He flipped through it carelessly, ignoring the gold diplomatic seal on its cover. Never seen one from your country before. He turned to his colleague, a shorter officer with a stern face. Hey Chen, you ever dealt with one of these? Officer Chen shrugged. Looks different from the usual ones. Amara took a deep breath, counting silently to 5 before speaking. My credentials are in order. I've traveled to over 30 countries with that passport, including multiple visits to the United States. A small crowd had gathered nearby, pretending to check their phones or wait for luggage, while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. An elderly woman shook her head disapprovingly, but whether at Amara or the officers, it wasn't clear. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step into our screening room for additional questioning, Officer Wilson said, gesturing toward a frosted glass door marked Security Personnel Only. May I ask why? Amara's voice remained calm, though her fingers tightened around the handle of her carry-on. I've provided all required documentation. Just procedure for certain situations, he replied vaguely. Your cooperation would be appreciated. A younger officer approached, whispering something in Wilson's ear. Wilson nodded and turned back to Amara. We need to verify the authenticity of your documents, he announced, loud enough for nearby travelers to hear. There have been cases of forged diplomatic credentials recently. This was a lie, and Amara knew it. Her country had excellent relations with the United States, and there had been no such reports. She felt heat rising to her face, but maintained her composure. I understand security concerns, she said carefully, but I must insist that you handle these documents with care. They contain sensitive international agreements that are protected under diplomatic protocol. Officer Wilson snorted. Protocol applies when we've established you're actually who you say you are. A businessman waiting nearby couldn't hide his discomfort at the officer's tone. He caught Amara's eye briefly, then looked away, embarrassed to be witnessing such treatment but unwilling to intervene. I'd like to contact my embassy, Amara said, reaching for her phone. That won't be necessary right now, Officer Wilson replied, placing his hand over her phone. First, we need to complete our screening process. A third officer arrived, this one with more stripes on his uniform. He surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes. What's the situation here, Wilson? He asked. Possible fraudulent diplomatic credentials, sir. The passenger was selected for random screening, and we found some inconsistencies. The lie hung in the air like a bad smell. Amara straightened her back, standing at her full height. There are no inconsistencies, she said firmly. I am here at the invitation of your State Department for the African Economic Summit. These officers have been handling my diplomatic documents improperly and making false claims about their authenticity. The supervising officer looked from Amara to the scattered papers on the table. A flash of uncertainty crossed his face. Wilson, what exactly is suspicious about these documents? Officer Wilson hesitated. Well, sir, they don't match our usual Protocol 4. Which protocol specifically? Amara interrupted, her patience finally wearing thin. I've presented a valid diplomatic passport, official credentials from my government, and an invitation from your State Department. Under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, to which both our countries are signatories, my documents and I are entitled to certain courtesies and immunities. The mention of specific international law caused a flicker of concern on the supervisor's face. Nearby travelers had stopped pretending not to listen and were now openly watching the confrontation. Someone had taken out their phone and appeared to be recording. Ma'am, no one is questioning international law, the supervisor began, his tone suddenly more conciliatory. That's precisely what's happening, Amara replied, her voice clear and unwavering. And I need to know right now. Am I being detained, or am I free to proceed to my hotel, where representatives from your government are waiting for me? The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Amara stood tall, her question hanging between them as the supervising officer shifted uncomfortably. More travelers had stopped to watch the confrontation, and the number of phones recording the incident had grown from 1 to at least 5. "We're simply following procedure, ma'am," the supervisor finally said, avoiding her direct question. He turned to Officer Wilson. "Let's continue this in the screening room." "No," Amara said firmly. "I will not be moved to a private room where there are no witnesses. Either charge me with something specific or allow me to continue on my way." Officer Wilson's face flushed red. "This attitude isn't helping your situation." "My attitude?" Amara's voice remained controlled but carried across the now silent area. "I've been nothing but professional while you've treated my diplomatic credentials like trash, made false accusations, and attempted to intimidate me." An older woman with silver hair stepped forward from the crowd. "I've been watching this whole thing," she announced in a wavering voice. "This is absolutely shameful. I've traveled through this airport for 40 years, and I've never seen anyone with proper papers treated this way." Officer Wilson glared at the woman. "Ma'am, please step back. This is a security matter." "It's discrimination is what it is," she replied, standing her ground. "My husband was a diplomat for 30 years. I know what diplomatic credentials look like." The supervisor looked increasingly uncomfortable as more people in the crowd nodded in agreement. A younger man in a business suit called out, "I'm recording this for my law firm's social media. We specialize in international travel incidents." Amara seized the moment. "I would like to call my embassy now. And after that, I'll be contacting the State Department about this treatment." "That won't be necessary," came a new voice from behind the security checkpoint. A woman in a crisp black suit pushed through the crowd, her airport security badge swinging from a lanyard around her neck. The name Dr. Rivera was printed in bold letters beneath her photo. Behind her stood two more officials in suits, both looking concerned. "I'm the Director of International Relations for this airport," Dr. Rivera said, her voice carrying authority. "What's happening here?" Before Officer Wilson could speak, Amara stepped forward. "I'm being detained without cause. My diplomatic credentials have been questioned, mishandled, and dismissed despite being completely valid. I've asked repeatedly to contact my embassy." Dr. Rivera's eyes widened as she spotted the diplomatic passport and official documents spread carelessly across the table. She quickly moved to examine them, handling them with noticeable care. A stark contrast to Officer Wilson's earlier treatment. "These are in perfect order," she said after a moment, looking up with alarm. "Deputy Minister Okafor, on behalf of this airport, I deeply apologize for this situation." Officer Wilson's mouth opened in surprise. "You know who she is?" "I don't personally know the Deputy Minister, but I recognize legitimate diplomatic credentials when I see them," Dr. Rivera replied sharply. "And these are absolutely authentic." The crowd murmured, and someone whispered, "I knew it." Dr. Rivera turned to the supervising officer. "How long has the Deputy Minister been held here?" The supervisor checked his watch nervously. "About 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Dr. Rivera's voice rose in disbelief. "With valid diplomatic credentials in hand, this is completely unacceptable." She turned back to Amara. "Deputy Minister, please allow me to personally escort you out of here. Your credentials will be respected and will ensure you reach your destination without further delay." Officer Wilson stepped forward. "But we haven't completed the security." "Officer Wilson," Dr. Rivera cut him off, her voice ice cold. "You are dismissed from this checkpoint immediately. Report to my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. The crowd around them had grown larger, with travelers openly watching the dramatic turn of events. Someone in the back started a slow clap that quickly spread. "Thank you," Amara said to Dr. Rivera, maintaining her dignity despite the humiliation she'd endured. "I appreciate your intervention, but this incident cannot simply disappear. My diplomatic immunity was violated, and that has serious implications." Dr. Rivera nodded gravely. "Of course, we will follow all proper protocols for reporting this incident to the State Department and your embassy, and there will be consequences internally as well." Officer Wilson stood frozen, the color draining from his face as he finally grasped the severity of his actions. The supervising officer was already on his phone, speaking quickly and quietly, likely to his own superior. As Dr. Rivera carefully gathered Amara's documents and returned them to her with an apologetic bow, a transformation swept through the security checkpoint. The same officers who had treated her with suspicion and disdain now couldn't meet her eyes. The power dynamics had shifted completely. "Deputy Minister, your car is waiting outside," Dr. Rivera said, gesturing toward the exit. "I have alerted the State Department representatives about the delay and this unfortunate situation." As Amara collected her belongings, now hastily repacked by apologetic security staff, she caught the eye of the elderly woman who had spoken up for her. The woman gave her a small, sad smile and a nod of respect. In that simple exchange was a recognition of something they both understood too well, that without her diplomatic status, this story might have had a very different ending. The Grand Hotel lobby buzzed with activity as Amara stepped through the revolving doors. Despite the late hour, diplomats and officials from around the world mingled, their quiet conversations creating a gentle hum in the marble-floored space. The incident at the airport still clung to her like an unwelcome shadow, but she straightened her shoulders, determined not to let it affect her mission. "Deputy Minister Okafor," a voice called from across the lobby. A tall man in a charcoal suit hurried toward her, concern etched on his face. "We were worried when you didn't arrive with the others. I'm Thomas Chen from the State Department." "Mr. Chen," Amara acknowledged with a nod. "I apologize for the delay. There was an incident at the airport." His eyebrows shot up. "An incident?" "I was detained by security despite presenting my diplomatic credentials," she explained, keeping her voice low. Dr. Rivera from Airport Relations eventually intervened. Thomas's face darkened. "That's completely unacceptable. I'll make some calls immediately." "Thank you, but there's something more important right now," Amara said, glancing at her watch. "The pre-summit meeting starts in just 12 hours, and I need to be prepared." Thomas hesitated, clearly troubled by what she'd shared, but nodded. "Of course. Let me show you to your room, and we can discuss tomorrow's agenda on the way." As they walked toward the elevators, Amara's phone buzzed with a notification. The screen showed a news alert. "Diplomatic incident at JFK. Video goes viral." Her heart sank as she clicked on the link. There she was, standing tall as Officer Wilson circled her like a predator. The video had already gathered thousands of views in just 2 hours. "Oh no," Thomas muttered, looking over her shoulder at the screen. "This is going to complicate things." "It seems someone's recording reached the media," Amara said, suddenly feeling weary. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside. "The State Department will need to issue a formal response," Thomas said as they ascended. "And your embassy will likely want to make a statement as well." Amara nodded, scrolling through the comments beneath the video. Many expressed outrage at her treatment, while others defended the security officers. The stark division reflected the broader tensions that made her work so crucial. The elevator chimed, and they exited onto a quiet floor. Thomas led her down a carpeted hallway, stopping at a door near the end. "This is your suite," he said, handing her a keycard. "The conference briefing materials are already inside, along with some refreshments. Is there anything else you need tonight?" Before she could answer, both their phones buzzed simultaneously. Thomas pulled his out first, his eyes widening. "The Secretary of State is calling an emergency meeting about your incident," he said, looking up at her. "It's just been escalated to the highest levels." Amara took a deep breath. What had begun as a humiliating detention was now becoming an international diplomatic situation. "I should join that meeting," she said firmly. Thomas nodded. "I'll arrange it." They're gathering in 30 minutes in the secure conference room on the mezzanine level. Inside her suite, Amara barely had time to set down her bags before her phone rang. It was the Prime Minister from her home country. "Madam Deputy Minister," his deep voice came through, concern evident in his tone. "I've just been briefed about the incident at JFK. Are you all right?" "Yes, Prime Minister," she assured him, shaken but unharmed. "This is outrageous," he continued. "I've instructed our ambassador to file a formal diplomatic protest. The Foreign Ministry is drafting a statement condemning the mistreatment of our representative." Amara moved to the window, looking out at the glittering city lights. "Sir, while I appreciate the support, we must be careful. The African Economic Summit is too important to be overshadowed by this incident." A pause on the line. "What do you suggest?" "Let me handle the immediate response with the Americans," she said thoughtfully. "We can use this unfortunate event to push for stronger protections for all diplomats, especially those from African nations, But let's keep our focus on the trade agreements we came to negotiate. The Prime Minister's tone softened with pride. This is why you're our top diplomat, Amara. You see the bigger picture. Handle it as you see fit, but know that you have the full backing of our government. After ending the call, Amara quickly freshened up and changed into a clean suit. As she fastened her grandmother's gold brooch to her lapel, a tradition before important meetings, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Dr. Rivera. Officer Wilson has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Airport director wants to meet with you tomorrow to personally apologize. Video of incident now at 50,000 views. I'm deeply sorry this happened under our watch. Amara stared at the message, emotions swirling. The swift response was gratifying, but the public nature of the incident complicated her diplomatic mission. As she headed to the door, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Beyond the immaculate suit and professional demeanor was a woman who had just been publicly humiliated because of her skin color, only to be vindicated because of her position. How many others without diplomatic immunity face this every day? She whispered to herself, the question weighing heavily on her heart. The knock at her door signaled Thomas's return to escort her to the emergency meeting. As she opened it, she made a split-second decision about how to approach the gathering of high-level officials waiting downstairs. This wouldn't just be about her individual experience anymore. She would use her position to speak for those who had no immunity to protect them from such treatment. The conference room fell silent as Amara entered, followed closely by Thomas. Around an oval mahogany table sat 8 people, their expressions ranging from concerned to uncomfortable. At the head of the table, a woman with short gray hair and piercing eyes stood up. Deputy Minister Okafor, I'm Carol Washington, Undersecretary of State, she said, extending her hand. On behalf of the United States government, I want to express our deepest apologies for the treatment you received at JFK today. Amara shook her hand, nodding slightly. Thank you, Madam Undersecretary. Please have a seat. Carol gestured to an empty chair. We've been reviewing the video footage and eyewitness accounts. The behavior displayed by our security personnel was unacceptable. As Amara sat down, she noticed a laptop at the center of the table displaying the viral video, paused at the moment Officer Wilson was gesturing dismissively at her diplomatic passport. The view count now showed over 100,000. The officer in question has been placed on administrative leave, said a stern-looking man in a navy suit who introduced himself as the head of airport security operations. And a full investigation is already underway. Amara took a sip of water from the glass in front of her, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was measured but firm. I appreciate the swift response, she began, but this isn't just about one officer or one incident. What happened to me today happens to countless travelers who don't have diplomatic immunity to protect them. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. A few officials exchanged glances. With all due respect, Deputy Minister, the security head said, our protocols are designed to treat all travelers equitably. This was an isolated. It wasn't, Amara interrupted gently. And we all know it wasn't. She pulled out her phone and opened her email. In the 2 hours since the video went viral, I've received over 50 messages from African diplomats and officials sharing similar experiences at U.S. airports. The only difference is that most didn't have someone filming or an airport director who recognized their credentials. Thomas shifted in his seat beside her. I can confirm that the State Department has received numerous complaints of this nature over the past few years. Carol Washington's face showed genuine concern. What do you suggest, Deputy Minister? We want to make this right. Amara looked around the table, making eye contact with each person. First, I want to continue with the economic summit as planned. The agreements we're working on are too important to sideline. Several officials nodded in relief. Second, she continued, I propose we use this unfortunate incident as an opportunity for positive change. I'd like to work with your team to develop a comprehensive training program for airport security personnel, focusing on diplomatic protocols and cultural sensitivity. That's certainly reasonable, Carol agreed. And third, Amara said, her voice growing stronger, I want a review of security stopping practices at all major U.S. airports with data collected on racial disparities in secondary screenings. If we don't measure the problem, we can't fix it. The security chief looked like he wanted to object, but Carol spoke first. These are constructive suggestions, Deputy Minister. We'll begin implementing them immediately. A woman at the end of the table who had been quietly taking notes looked up. The press is asking for statements. The video has now been picked up by major networks. Carol turned to Amara. Would you be willing to participate in a joint press conference tomorrow? We can announce these initiatives together, showing a unified response. Amara considered the request carefully. Her instinct was to focus solely on the economic negotiations, but she recognized the power of this moment. Yes, she finally said, but I'd like to review the statement beforehand. As the meeting continued, they discussed logistics for the press conference and the summit. Throughout the conversation, Amara noticed a subtle shift in how the officials addressed her. Where there had been polite diplomacy before, there was now genuine respect. When the meeting concluded nearly 2 hours later, Carol asked Amara to stay behind for a moment. Off the record, Carol said once they were alone, I want to thank you for your grace in handling this situation. You could have created an international incident that would have derailed the entire summit. Amara smiled slightly. That wouldn't have served anyone's interests, least of all the people our trade agreements will help. Carol nodded appreciatively. Still, many in your position would have reacted differently. My grandmother was a civil rights activist in the 1960s, Amara explained. She always said, when they give you a seat at the table, don't just sit there, change the menu. As they left the conference room together, Amara's phone buzzed with another news alert. The video had now been viewed over 500,000 times, with hashtags demanding accountability trending worldwide. Back in her hotel suite, Amara finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands slightly trembling as the adrenaline of the day finally wore off. She thought about calling her family, but decided against waking them at such a late hour back home. Instead, she opened her laptop to review her notes for the summit. As she scrolled through trade proposals and economic forecasts, a notification popped up, an email from a young black woman studying international relations at a university in Boston. Dear Deputy Minister Okafor, it read, I saw what happened to you today at JFK. I've experienced similar treatment when traveling, but never had the power to make anyone listen. Watching you stand your ground with such dignity showed me what's possible. Thank you for representing us. Because of you, I'm more determined than ever to pursue my diplomatic dreams. Amara read the message twice, her throat tightening with emotion. This, she realized, was the true power of diplomatic immunity, not just the protection it offered her, but the platform it gave her to speak for others. With renewed purpose, she began drafting her remarks for tomorrow's press conference, determined to use this painful experience as a catalyst for meaningful change. Camera flashes popped like lightning as Amara stepped behind the podium. The hotel's press room was packed wall to wall with journalists, their eager faces tilted up toward her. Beside her stood Undersecretary Washington, composed but visibly nervous about the international attention this incident had drawn. Good morning, Amara began, her voice steady and clear. Yesterday, I arrived at JFK International Airport as a diplomatic representative of my nation. Today, I stand before you not only as a diplomat, but as someone determined to ensure what happened to me doesn't happen to others. More camera flashes, reporters leaned forward, pens poised over notepads. The video that many of you have seen shows only 45 minutes of what countless travelers experience every day, she continued. The difference is that my diplomatic status eventually protected me. Many others have no such protection. A reporter called out, Deputy Minister, how has this affected relations between our countries? Amara gestured to the Undersecretary, who stepped forward. The incident at JFK was unacceptable and does not reflect American values, Washington stated firmly. We are working closely with Deputy Minister Okafor to implement immediate changes in training and oversight at all major ports of entry. Another reporter stood. Can you elaborate on these changes? Amara nodded. We've agreed on a 3-part initiative. Comprehensive training for security personnel on diplomatic protocols, cultural sensitivity training for all airport staff, and a data collection system to track and address potential bias in security screenings. The press conference continued for 30 minutes. with questions coming rapid-fire from journalists representing outlets around the world. Throughout it all, Amara maintained her composure, speaking with authority but without anger. When it was over, social media was already buzzing with clips of her responses, particularly her final statement. "Diplomatic immunity protected me yesterday. Today, I'm using that privilege to protect others." As she exited the press room, Thomas approached with a tablet in hand. "The summit organizers need to know if you're still planning to leave the afternoon trade session." "Absolutely," Amara replied without hesitation. "That's why I'm here." "You've become quite the sensation," Thomas said, showing her the trending hashtags. #DiplomatisImmunity, #AmaraOkafor, and #AirportJustice were all in the top 10 worldwide. Amara handed the tablet back. "Let's make sure this attention translates into real change." The economic summit proceeded as planned, with Amara delivering a powerful presentation on agricultural trade opportunities between African nations and the United States. Yet everyone in the room knew her with a new context, not just as an economic expert, but as someone who had stood her ground against discrimination and emerged victorious. During a break between sessions, Amara checked her phone to find hundreds of new messages. Among them was a notification that Officer Wilson had released a public apology, admitting to unconscious bias and pledging to undergo additional training. The airport had announced a review of all security protocols, with Dr. Rivera appointed to lead a new Office of Traveler Rights and Dignity. Most surprising was an email from the White House. The president wanted to meet with her before she left the country to discuss the new airport security initiatives and broader matters of international cooperation. As Amara tucked her phone away, a young black woman who had been serving coffee approached her hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you, Deputy Minister," she said quietly, "but I just wanted to say thank you. My brother was detained at an airport for hours last month for no reason. What you're doing matters to people like us." Amara reached out and squeezed the woman's hand. "Thank you for telling me that." Later that evening, after the day's summit sessions had concluded, Amara found herself sitting in a small restaurant with several other African diplomats. The conversation inevitably turned to her experience. "You've handled this with remarkable grace," said an older diplomat from Nigeria. "I was detained at Dallas-Fort Worth last year, showed my diplomatic passport, and was still held for 3 hours. I wish I'd had someone filming. My assistant was stopped just last month," added a Kenyan trade minister. "No diplomatic status to protect her. They went through her phone, her personal photos, everything." Amara listened as story after story emerged, each diplomat recounting similar experiences. The pattern was undeniable and painful to hear. "The difference now," she said when there was a pause, "is that we have the world's attention. The question is, what will we do with it?" "What are you thinking?" asked the Nigerian diplomat. Amara leaned forward. "I'm thinking we create an international coalition. We document these incidents systematically. We use diplomatic channels to demand accountability. And we make sure these new airport procedures are actually implemented, not just announced and forgotten." The energy around the table shifted as the others nodded in agreement. "Count me in," said the Kenyan minister, raising his glass in a toast to turning immunity into action. As glasses clinked, Amara felt a strange mix of emotions: regret that such incidents were so common, anger at the systems that allowed them to continue, but also hope that perhaps her painful experience might spark meaningful change. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, she noticed #Diplomatic Dignity was now trending worldwide. People were sharing their own stories of mistreatment at borders and checkpoints, creating a global conversation about respect, dignity, and equality. What had begun as a humiliating detention had transformed into something much bigger than herself, a movement demanding that everyone, regardless of status, be treated with basic human dignity. 3 months had passed since that fateful day at JFK. Amara stood once again in the same airport terminal, watching travelers move through the security checkpoint. But everything was different now. New digital signs displayed clear information about travelers' rights in multiple languages. Security officers wore badges indicating they had completed the newly implemented cultural sensitivity and diplomatic protocol training. And most noticeably, a diverse team of observers in blue vests monitored the screening process, clipboards in hand, ensuring procedures were followed properly. Deputy Minister Okafor, a familiar voice called. Dr. Rivera approached with a warm smile. "Welcome back to New York." "Dr. Rivera," Amara greeted her with a handshake. "The changes are impressive." "Would you like a tour of the new procedures?" Dr. Rivera asked, gesturing toward the security area. "Your flight doesn't leave for another 2 hours." Amara nodded, and they walked together toward the checkpoint. As they approached, a security officer recognized Amara immediately. His eyes widened, but instead of discomfort, his expression showed respect. "Deputy Minister," he said with a polite nod. "Welcome to JFK. May I see your credentials, please?" Amara presented her diplomatic passport, which the officer examined carefully but efficiently, handling the document with evident respect. "Everything is in order," he said, returning it to her with a slight bow. "Thank you for your patience." As they continued walking, Dr. Rivera pointed out the changes. "We've installed cameras at every station, with footage reviewed daily by an independent oversight committee. Security officers now receive weekly training updates, and we've implemented a tracking system to monitor selection patterns for additional screening." "And Officer Wilson?" Amara asked quietly. Dr. Rivera's expression grew serious. "After completing sensitivity training and community service, he requested a transfer to our training department. Surprisingly, he's become one of our most effective instructors, sharing his experience as a cautionary tale." They paused near a wall displaying a large poster with the words "Respect, Dignity, Security" prominently featured. "The data from our first quarterly report shows a 74% decrease in complaints about discriminatory treatment," Dr. Rivera continued. "And we've received commendations from 12 embassies about improved experiences for their diplomatic staff." But what struck Amara most was watching an elderly black woman go through security. The officers treated her with the same efficiency and respect they had shown to the white businessman ahead of her. No extra questions, no suspicious glances, just professional courtesy. "You know," Dr. Rivera said, following Amara's gaze, "your case wasn't just about changing procedures. It changed mindsets." As they walked, a young security officer approached them nervously. "Excuse me, Deputy Minister Okafor," she said. "I just wanted to say that your story is now part of our core training. It's made a real difference in how we approach our work." Amara thanked her, touched by the unexpected impact. They continued the tour, stopping at the newly established Office of Traveler Rights and Dignity, where travelers could report concerns and receive immediate assistance. The office walls displayed information in 20 languages, with staff members representing diverse backgrounds. "This is only the beginning," Dr. Rivera explained. "The program you helped create is being implemented at 17 major airports across the country, with plans to expand to all international ports of entry by next year." Amara's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an update from the International Coalition for Traveler Dignity, the organization she had helped establish with her fellow African diplomats. Their app for documenting discriminatory treatment at borders had just reached 50,000 downloads. "Your flight to Geneva will be boarding soon," Dr. Rivera noted. "The UN Conference on Border Security Practices, correct?" Amara nodded. "I'm presenting our coalition's first global report. We've collected data from travelers across 63 countries." As they walked toward the departure gate, several travelers recognized Amara, offering smiles or respectful nods. A teenager even whispered excitedly to her mother, "That's her, the diplomat from the video." Dr. Rivera smiled. "You've become something of a legend around here." "I never wanted to be a legend," Amara replied honestly. "I just wanted to be treated with basic dignity." At the gate, they paused to say goodbye. "What you experienced that day was awful," Dr. Rivera said, "but the change it sparked has been remarkable." Amara thought about the coalition, the new training programs, the data collection systems, and most importantly, the ordinary travelers who would never know the humiliation she had faced. "Sometimes," she replied, "it takes someone with privilege to open doors for those without it. The diplomatic immunity that protected me that day now protects countless others." As she boarded her flight, Amara recalled a message she had received that morning from a young woman who had been inspired by her story to pursue a career in international relations. "You showed me that one person really can change the system," the message had said. Settling into her seat, Amara gazed out the window at the sprawling airport below. The incident that had begun with humiliation had transformed into something powerful and lasting. Her diplomatic immunity had done more than just protect her that day. It had become a shield for others who had no such protection. As the plane lifted into the clouds, Amara opened her laptop to review her presentation for the UN conference. The title slide read, "Beyond Immunity: Creating Systems of Dignity for All." The small photo in the corner showed her standing tall at JFK Airport, diplomatic passport in hand, facing down injustice with quiet determination. Sometimes, Amara reflected, the most meaningful diplomatic work happens not in grand conference halls or formal negotiations, but in ordinary moments when someone with power chooses to stand up for those without it. Her grandmother would have been proud.